The first thing you notice from the very beginning of Super Mario Bros. 2 is that this is quite an odd game. Its visuals are bizarre, its gameplay is unorthodox, and you rarely have the slightest idea of what the game will throw at you next. But like a good mystery novel, Super Mario Bros. 2 only seems nonsensical until you discover the twist that makes everything fall into place, the key to the riddle, you might say. Or rather, in this case, multiple keys. A company manager focused relentlessly on appealing to the American video game market. A hotshot producer whose head was full of wild ideas. A newly minted designer interested in breaking the mold of previous platformers. And one of the most successful arcade games of the early 1980s, brought to the United States by a quirky Japanese studio whose name begins with an N. By which I of course mean Nintendo's Donkey Kong, first released worldwide in July of 1981. A lot of people are aware that Donkey Kong was Nintendo's first real international hit, and that it paved the way, and provided the funding, for the subsequent release of the Nintendo Entertainment System, and the worldwide acclaim that followed. What isn't so well known is that Donkey Kong was essentially a Hail Mary play from a company that came dangerously close to being booted out of the American market altogether and losing everything. What I'm talking about here isn't Nintendo as a whole, but a division of Nintendo that was founded in 1980 with the express purpose of breaking into the American arcade market, and given the suitably straightforward name Nintendo of America. The company manager, who I mentioned a minute ago, is the founder of Nintendo of America, Minoru Arakawa, a visionary businessman who also happened to be Hiroshi Yamauchi's son-in-law, having married Yamauchi's daughter Yoko in 1973. Now, marrying your boss's daughter in 1970s Japan wasn't seen as all that different from doing the same thing in, say, America in the 1950s, so you might think of this as a sign of his ambition, practicality, and maybe a bit of greed. Which is where you'd be wrong, actually, because in 1973, Hiroshi Yamauchi was not his boss. Arakawa was working at this time for a company called Marubeni, a conglomerate with roots in the Japanese textile industry. It just so happens that Arakawa himself came from a wealthy family whose fortune was also tied up in textiles. Trained as a civil engineer, he was managing real estate for Marubeni when he met Yoko Yamauchi at a Christmas party in Kyoto. In fact, Arakawa wasn't involved with Nintendo in any capacity during the first 7 years of his married life. But Yamauchi must have liked and trusted him, at least to the extent that he liked and trusted anybody, because in 1980 he offered Arakawa the job of creating and managing Nintendo's American marketing and distribution arm. At this time, Arakawa was living in Vancouver with his wife and 2 young daughters, with a safe and comfortable career working on Marubeni's overseas properties ahead of him, as long as he just kept his mind on his work and politely said no. But like a good businessman and a dutiful son-in-law, and also possibly because Japanese people find it hard to say no, even politely, he took the new job. Arakawa and his family moved to New York City right away to research the American arcade market and lease a warehouse to hold inventory. This probably seemed like a good first step. After all, New York City was, and to a certain extent still is, the business capital of the United States, with a huge population of consumers for product testing and easy access to financial institutions. But for an Asian import business, which is essentially what Nintendo of America was, this is a pretty horrible location. The most critical problem was geographical. A product from Japan could reach essentially any major city on the West Coast within about a week and a half by boat. Getting the same thing to New York's harbor could take several months, and for something as bulky as, say, an arcade cabinet, alternate methods like overland trucking or air freight were out of the question. They were just too expensive. This brings up a related problem. Because shipping to the West Coast was so much easier, the intermediate firms and infrastructure that supported Japanese importing tended to be located there. People in Seattle and San Francisco were familiar with Japanese imports. They knew how to handle them and how to do business with Japanese companies. In many cases, the American companies involved in this field were run by Japanese people. I'm not saying there were no Japanese import businesses in New York City. Any market as large as that is bound to attract businesses of every kind. But Nintendo wasn't planning on dipping a toe into the American market. It wanted a saturation campaign, and doing that from a base in New York City would be practically impossible. Another, more personal problem with New York is that it's, well, New York. It's crowded and cramped, and everyone's always moving at 100 miles an hour. You might think that Japanese people would be used to this, but both Arakawa and his wife, and Nintendo itself for that matter, grew up in Kyoto, which has always been a rather sleepy and old-fashioned city compared to the urban colossus of Tokyo. All this came to a head when Arakawa made his first big move as the head of Nintendo of America. Actually, huge move might be a better description. He ordered 3,000 cabinets of Nintendo's new game Radar Scope, a shooter based on the Space Invaders model in which enemy ships would zoom toward the player, sort of like Namco's Galaxian, but with less visual variety, partly compensated for by a skewed perspective and sprite scaling that made it look almost three-dimensional. Arakawa assumed that radar scope had serious hit potential in the United States. Shooters were hot back then, and this was basically a better version of Space Invaders, which made like $1 kajillion. It even looked 3D. How could it possibly fail? In retrospect, we can see this as a classic case of bad timing due to misreading the market. Yes, it was true that everybody had played Space Invaders 100 times, and then everybody went and played Galaxian 80 times, and new shooters aimed at the same market were constantly coming out. But if you think about it, this means that while the shooter market itself may be growing every year, each individual game could be getting less popular, even if everyone agrees that the new games are better. I would say that Nintendo missed the boat here, but it's more like their boat missed the boat. From Arakawa's initial order, it took 4 months for the cabinets to arrive in New York City, and by the time they got there, not only were shooters starting to feel a bit stale, but there was a new fad on the horizon, Namco's Pac-Man, and all the maze-chasing madness that went with it. The result was a financial bloodbath for the new division. Arakawa was only able to sell 1,000 cabinets, a third of his order, and the buyers weren't even really happy with the 1,000 that they took, because people barely played them. Meanwhile, there were 2,000 radar scope cabinets sitting unsold in a warehouse in New Jersey, a liability that Nintendo of America simply could not afford in the long run. There was only one positive about the situation. A lot of the most expensive parts of an arcade game are embodied in the cabinet itself, the wood and glass and metal. The actual game, the software, made up only a small part of the product. With a little ingenuity, you could swap out one game for another even after the cabinet was constructed, and the software was cheap and easy to ship on its own. So Arakawa took 2 steps to ensure the future of Nintendo of America. First, he relocated from the New York City area to Seattle, which is where they market-tested radar scope anyway, and which suited his needs much more. And second, he got in touch with Nintendo's management back home and made a request simple in formulation, but complex in its implications. We need a new game. Nintendo of America needed a game that was new, not just in the literal sense, but also in the way that Pac-Man was new. A novelty, something that would surprise people and stand out in a sea of shallow, derivative shooters. And as luck would have it, the man that Hiroshi Yamauchi selected to design this new game was exactly the kind of person who would bring a fresh approach to the problem. For one thing, he had never actually designed a game before. It's hard to say exactly why Shigeru Miyamoto was picked to lead development on Donkey Kong. It could be because Nintendo's president had an eye for undiscovered talent. But it could also be because his more experienced designers and engineers were busy working on other, less risky projects, like the Game & Watch series, which proved to be a massive success. What is certain is that Miyamoto was originally hired to work at Nintendo as an artist, not a programmer, and that this professional background had a huge influence on the games he would go on to design. Miyamoto would talk to the programmers and ask them to do things that they'd never done before. He didn't realize how difficult something like multiple stages or sloped platforms would be to implement, because he wasn't a programmer. Yet ironically, by asking for things that seemed impossible, Miyamoto showed his colleagues what was possible. You don't know what the limit is until you bump into it, which most people aren't inclined to do because, well, it hurts. But with the help of producer Gunpei Yokoi, another of Nintendo's great visionaries, the team achieved most of what Miyamoto wanted and ended up with possibly the most ambitious game that the arcade world had seen up to that point. Right away, it was sent to Nintendo of America, where Minoru Arakawa's American sales team immediately had serious reservations about this new product. I mean, it wasn't a shooter or a Pac-Man clone. How would you know in advance if anyone liked it? But Arakawa had a gut feeling that Donkey Kong was exactly what he had asked for, something special that would take the arcade world by storm, and this time he was dead right. This near-disastrous failure, followed by an unexpected and spectacular success, was a formative experience in his gaming career that he was unlikely to ever forget. Now, you're probably saying at this point, hey, what does all this have to do with Super Mario Bros. 2? Well, the fact is that when the game that we in America call Super Mario Bros. 2 came out, there had already been a sequel to Super Mario Bros. On Japanese shelves for more than a year, and this game much more closely resembled what you would expect from a sequel to a game that was considered practically perfect on release. In other words, it did almost exactly the same thing, with a few minor tweaks. The Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2, which later appeared in the US as part of a compilation under the title The Lost Levels, has the same basic mechanics and challenges as Super Mario Bros., but now you can play as Luigi, who for the first time has different jumping physics from his big bro. There are 20 bonus levels after the main campaign, bumping the total count to 52 unique stages. And there's also some new level gimmicks, like wind that blows you back and forth, enemies appearing in new areas, and springboards that launch you way up off the top of the screen, leaving you uncertain as to where you'll eventually land. Really, uncertainty is what this game is all about. Unlike in the original, here you have secret blocks that punt you into bottomless pits, one-up mushrooms that actually kill you, warp pipes that take you backwards, and other touches that amply demonstrate why back in the day the most difficult games were called Nintendo Hard. But generally speaking, there's nothing in the Lost Levels that Nintendo couldn't have done the year before when they made the original. This game came out in the same year and on the same console as The Legend of Zelda, yet none of that game's originality is apparent here. Most inexcusably from my perspective, there aren't even any new enemies, despite enemy variety being a major source of the original's appeal. The Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2 was safe, simple, and to Nintendo's great relief, successful. It ended up outselling The Legend of Zelda and every other Nintendo Disk System game with a healthy 2.5 million copies. Also, Minoru Arakawa hated it. Okay, maybe hate is too strong a word. What he actually said was that he was concerned about American players being turned off by the game's high difficulty and repetitiveness. A minor iteration on the original was just fine for a game that released less than a year after the original, on a console that mainly die-hard fans were going to have. It also has to be said that despite the success of Donkey Kong, Nintendo was still an underdog in the United States, where a greater variety of games, both old and new, competed for a piece of American children's famously short attention spans. American gamers were picky, and shifts in popular taste were hard to predict, as Arakawa had discovered to his considerable chagrin a few years before with Radar Scope. It was hard to know what they would want, but he knew from experience that one of the worst ways to predict it was to look at what they were playing 2 or 3 years before. What's more, there was no way that Super Mario Bros. 2 could come out in the United States quickly enough to coast on a wave of Mario fever. This was a game originally designed for the Nintendo Disk System, which didn't release in the US. Making it fit into an original NES cartridge, like the kind that Super Mario Bros. Was made for, would require ruthless cutting, and eliminate a lot of the point of buying the newer game. Either that, or they could do something creative, which would also take quite some time. You might have wondered in the previous video how I could say that Super Mario Bros. Is the ultimate cartridge game that pushed the NES to its limits, when the NES still had 5 years left to go before being replaced, and Nintendo games from the late 80s are clearly more complicated and require more space than it did. Well, that's because Super Mario Bros. Was the most complicated game that could fit on an original NES cartridge. What eventually broke through that limitation was the development of better cartridges, with mapper chips in them that allowed the NES to call information from multiple memory banks located within one plastic housing. With this, you could effectively squeeze multiple games worth of content onto one cartridge, and the console would smoothly shift from one chip to another when so instructed, offloading the work from the NES itself to the cartridge inside. This was a brilliant concept, but unfortunately, Nintendo was not the first company to realize it. The first NES game to take advantage of the new cartridge design was a port of Capcom's arcade hit Ghosts and Goblins, developed by the American computer company Micronix. Less than a year later, Capcom's dogged rival Konami used the same tech to create the NES version of Castlevania, and after that point, the race was really on. Nintendo was in the race at this time, having released Kid Icarus on a cartridge in Europe in February of 1987, but it took them a while to hit their stride here in the US, until finally, in August of that year, they came out with an almost unbeatable 1-2 punch of NES games, The Legend of Zelda and Metroid. So now, with Nintendo having regained the lead of making the best games for their own console, imagine you're Minoru Arakawa, considering the prospect of releasing the Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2 in the US. It's only been a year since it came out in Japan, but so much has happened in that year, and the last thing you want is for the Mario franchise of all things to lay an egg. If you do just localize this game, American customers are going to see the following progression of games on the NES: Ghosts and Goblins, Castlevania, The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, and then a slightly better version of Super Mario Bros., which I would argue is outdone by every other game on this list except maybe Ghosts and Goblins. Some people would probably have thought that a Super Mario Bros. Sequel was a safe bet in any market, But Arakawa was convinced that taking the easy way out here was really the risky option. So he passed on localizing the Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2, and once again requested that the team back in Japan make something fresh to please his demanding American customers. Unsurprisingly, the man to fill this order was the same one who had saved his butt back in 1981, Shigeru Miyamoto, now the head of the first division of Nintendo formed from top to bottom with the goal of making great video games. The American version of Super Mario Bros. 2 grew out of a game concept which was originally created to become the third Super Mario game for Japan. After all, the boys back home didn't have any intention of making nothing but Super Mario Bros. Expansion packs for the rest of their careers. And with the success of Super Mario Bros. 2 under their belt, they were able to convince the higher-ups to give them more time and creative freedom for this project. So the team set their sights higher, literally. The new concept, promoted by first-time designer Kensuke Tanabe, was to make a game where one or two players would travel for the most part vertically rather than horizontally, climbing up a series of towers by lifting and throwing each other, or stacking up blocks to form staircases. This idea of verticality would migrate to other game projects as well, most notably Kid Icarus and Metroid, in much the same way that concepts which hadn't worked for Super Mario Bros. Had previously been incorporated into The Legend of Zelda. But the parallel may have been a little too close in this case, because the vertical concept didn't seem to work for Mario either. Miyamoto then suggested including both vertical and horizontal movement, even though this would require the use of mapper chips which Nintendo was just learning how to use. And despite the added complexity, the consensus was still that this just wasn't fun, particularly for a solo player. Reluctantly, Tanabe and Miyamoto set the prototype aside to focus on other projects, until a few months later, when an unusual commission from a Japanese television conglomerate revitalized the concept. Yume Kojo, literally Dream Factory, was a month-and-a-half-long event promoted by Fuji TV, which would combine television specials, advertisements for their upcoming fall lineup, and a live festival and tech show celebrating new media. The proposed theming for the show incorporated artistic motifs from a variety of world cultures, particularly those of South America, Europe, and the Middle East. One of the keynotes of the event was to be a fictional story in which two Arabian children named Picky and Pokey are kidnapped by an evil frog who lives in a storybook, and the rest of the family, older brother Imagine, his girlfriend Lena, and his parents Papa and Mama, all jump into the book to go on a perilous rescue adventure. There were going to be branded products featuring these characters, appearances in promotional videos, and, since this was an event celebrating new media, they also really wanted a tie-in video game to release at the same time. Nintendo's management was eager to tackle the project, so Kensuke Tanabe was sent to Fuji TV's headquarters, where he was shown designs for the Yume Kojo characters and asked to get right to work building a game around them. Some studios back then might have half-assed a project like this. After all, it was basically a glorified advertisement for a TV network. But Nintendo doesn't often half-ass things, and they certainly weren't doing it back in the late 1980s. A team was assembled that happened to include most of the original Super Mario Bros. Developers, including producer Shigeru Miyamoto, programmers Toshihiko Nakago and Kazuaki Morita, and composer Koji Kondo. And since the game had a definite deadline in the near future, Kensuke Tanabe saw a perfect opportunity to save time by adapting their template for Mario 3 rather than starting from scratch. The Dream Factory imagery would give their previously bland prototype something that it needed more than any major gameplay innovation: an atmosphere. The result of the team's efforts was a game that played quite a bit like Mario, but went to places he would never dream of visiting in the first game. Sandy deserts, mountain ridges capped with surging waterfalls, freezing Arctic waters, a kingdom in the clouds. Doki Doki Panic wasn't a revelation gameplay-wise, the way that Super Mario Bros. Had been, but it was far more aesthetically appealing and evocative, suggesting a deeper world and narrative, even if the literal story was technically just as simple as before. By the way, if you're wondering about that name, Doki Doki is the onomatopoeia in Japan for a rapidly beating heart, sort of like thump thump in English, so the title is usually translated as heart-pounding panic. Doki Doki Panic released just a week before the start of Yume Kojo 87, and it sold pretty well for a tie-in game, about 200,000 copies. But of course that was small potatoes for a prototype that started out as Super Mario Bros. 3. So I can't imagine that Tanabe and his team were all that resistant to Minoru Arakawa's idea of adapting it into a new Mario game for the US market. The game had Mario guts in it to begin with, and even as Doki Doki Panic, it included nods to the Mario series, like Power Stars and POW Blocks. This also wasn't anything Nintendo hadn't done before. People sometimes like to put Super Mario Bros. 2 down as not really being a Mario game, because it's based on Doki Doki Panic. But even Donkey Kong, the game that gave us Mario in the first place, was originally going to be a licensed Popeye game, in which Pauline would have been Olive Oyl, and the Big Ape would have been Popeye's perennial rival Bluto. Does that mean that Donkey Kong is somehow not a real Mario game, even though it's the first one? Does it make Mario not a real Mario character? Of course not. And likewise, Super Mario Bros. 2 is a real Mario game, because Nintendo made it into a real Mario game. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here dwelling on the differences between it and Doki Doki Panic, both because most of the differences are minor ones, and because there's like 100 other videos on YouTube of people talking about that exact subject. Instead, I'm going to discuss the design and legacy of Super Mario Bros. 2 as a Mario game, because weird backstory details notwithstanding, that's exactly what it is. The story presented in Super Mario Bros. 2's manual isn't much longer than the one in Super Mario Bros., but it's presented in a more dramatic way. The game begins with Mario having a dream in which he climbs an enormous staircase, and passing through a door at the top, finds himself in a strange country. A voice tells him that this is the dreamland of Subcon, and begs him to defeat the evil tyrant Wart, who has taken it over and cursed the inhabitants. I guess Mario developed a reputation for this sort of thing after popping up in the Mushroom Kingdom last game. Anyway, he wakes up and tells Luigi, Toad, and Princess Toadstool about his dream, and they do what anybody would do under the circumstances: go on a picnic. While they're admiring the surroundings, Mario spots a nearby cave and decides to check it out. Inside, there's an enormous staircase, just like the one in his dream. At its top is a door, and when they all go through it, that's where you come in. Super Mario Bros. 2 famously begins with Mario falling onto a mountain peak, which he must descend to find a door leading to what you might call the first level proper. In gameplay terms, this is almost certainly to reinforce the point that the game will have a lot of vertical movement, which wasn't common in platformers back then, although anyone who experienced Metroid or Castlevania would be pretty familiar with the idea. But this also serves an important story purpose. It gives the game a surreal fairy tale quality that's sharply at odds with the original's more grounded and straightforward first level. Many stories have begun with the protagonist free-falling, but this has always specifically reminded me of Alice in Wonderland, especially because the drop is followed by a journey through a mysterious door. On the other hand, a very un-Alice-like touch is the fact that Mario is accompanied throughout by 3 partners with special talents, based on the 3 companions from Doki Doki Panic. Princess Toadstool is based on Imagine's girlfriend Lena, who could briefly float in midair after jumping. Toad is patterned after Papa, who was the fastest digger and could run quickly while holding an item. And since Luigi was already associated with high jumping, he naturally took the place of Mama, who had a high jump in the original. Mario himself was based on Imagine, the main character who was basically normal in every respect: average jump height, average running speed, and average digging ability. These 4 playable characters aren't really given much in the way of personality aside from their abilities, but one rather nice touch is that the manual features concept art for all of them, instead of simple sprites or nothing at all. You now get a much better idea of how the artists imagined the game in their heads, compared to the simplified 8-bit version actually featured on screen. This brought to the Mario series a tradition, which started with The Legend of Zelda, of having really charming manual art that Nintendo continued for about as long as manuals existed, or in other words, years ago at this point, but these images still constitute an early highlight in the evolution of concept art into something that companies wanted to show off to their customers. And Super Mario Bros. 2 had good reason to show off. Of the original trilogy, this middle entry has arguably the best art design, even if the third game could achieve some spectacular visual effects when it felt like it. The graphics here are bright and colorful, and many level elements are animated to create a more vibrant atmosphere. This is one big alteration that wasn't present in Doki Doki Panic. Mario has gone from looking kind of dopey and glum in Super Mario Bros. To looking happy and adventurous, and his friends are similarly more interesting to look at. This game was also a pioneer in the use of stagey elements in the visuals to add interest. Whereas Super Mario Bros. Just presented its world as if you were looking directly at it, Super Mario Bros. 2 opens each stage with what looks like a stage, with a curtain and everything, and the characters standing side by side like actors taking a bow at the end of a performance. Then there's the stage intro screen, which is designed to appear like an open book. This is actually a holdover from Doki Doki Panic, in which the characters were literally traveling through a book, and the reason why the last world has only 2 levels instead of the usual 3 is because the kidnapped twins accidentally ripped out the last page. And then at the end of each level, a giant slot machine appears, which lets you use your coins to play for 1-ups. This is arguably the first mini-game in Mario history, the first of many, as players of Mario 3 can attest. And the music? Okay, actually the music is a little bit of a downgrade here in terms of outright quality. The overworld theme is almost exactly the same length as in Super Mario Bros., with a similar structure. Opening jingle, then 2 variations on a simple melody, and a bridge which leads back to the beginning. But where the original was a peaceful-sounding calypso number, this feels more like ragtime, with a few distinctive piano-esque trills. Then there's the cave theme, which, sort of like the original's underground theme, is jazzy and percussion-driven, with what sounds like bongo drums setting the beat. And that's all you get, for about 90% of the game. The rest of the soundtrack is mostly composed of little jingles that play at important moments, like when you fight a boss or clear a world. There's some reused music from Super Mario Bros., like the main title theme, which is a variation of the original underwater theme, and the original overworld theme, which plays when you go into subspace. There's also a couple of tracks that are practically wasted in terms of how little you end up hearing them. The character select music has several distinct sections, but you're unlikely to ever listen to more than the first 5 seconds. And the final boss fight against Wart has a unique track that we probably could have used in some of this game's dozens of other boss encounters that all have the same 10-second jingle. Oh, and there's a theme for the end credits, which is actually pretty great. A nice reward for making it through the much more frustrating than Bowser final boss. Seriously though, most of the time you'll just be alternating between those 2 main themes, which is half of what the original game had. The clever part is how each stage alternates between the 2 themes, rather than featuring only one per stage. Together with the numerous jingles, it gives Super Mario Bros. 2 a more dramatic feel than you get from the original. I also happen to like the overworld theme a lot, which is probably why I didn't get irritated at all the repetition when I was a kid. I never really liked the cave theme though. That one gets old kind of quick. Frankly, I feel that Super Mario Bros.' music is just more pleasant to listen to. The second game's soundtrack has more complicated tunes, but fewer of them. It works with the gameplay perfectly well, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if the soundtrack was some players' least favorite part. It can all sound a bit clangy compared with the simple synth beeps of the original. Super Mario Bros. Had a better than average soundtrack and pretty bland graphics, and the game was served well by both choices. In the case of Super Mario Bros. 2, I feel that the improved graphics definitely enhance the experience, but the decision to shortchange the music hampers it. And yet, I'm still a big fan of this game, mostly for reasons we'll get into in the next section. So I've already discussed the different abilities of Super Mario Bros. 2's 4 playable characters, which enable them to get around stages in different ways and even take shortcuts, some of which may not really have been intended by the development team. But these characters actually have more in common than you'd think. They all have a basic moveset of running, jumping, and picking up and throwing various objects around the stage. And this moveset never changes, because unlike in the original Super Mario Bros., here there are no power-ups. Yeah, you heard me. No power-ups. There are certainly items that you can collect, like mushrooms that give you more health and power stars that make you temporarily invincible, but there's nothing like the Fire Flower, which gives you a new power and fundamentally changes the game's core mechanics. What Super Mario Bros. 2 has instead of power-ups is the ability to pick up various objects and throw them. The most common use of this ability is to get rid of enemies, since here they don't get hurt by being stepped on and have to be WrestleMania'd into each other to take them out. But you can also pluck things out of the ground to help you. Vegetables, which you can throw at enemies with no risk of being hurt yourself. Bombs, which explode after a few seconds to damage enemies and blocks, and you. POW blocks, making their triumphant return after first appearing in Mario Bros., which destroy all enemies on screen. Stopwatches, which briefly immobilize all enemies. And magic potions, which will open a mysterious door to subspace. Subspace is something I've never really understood, since I thought that the main overworld was already a dream realm to begin with. But apparently it's this spooky netherworld where it's always dusk, plants in the ground turn into coins which you can pluck for use in the end-of-level slot machine, and every now and then, giant mushrooms fall from the sky, enabling you to take an extra hit before dying. It's weird, you know? This is a weird game. And in case you even remotely doubt that fact, let's take a brief look at its roster of enemies, or throwable fowables, as I like to call them. There are a lot of these guys, so I'm going to focus on the ones that stuck around for later entries. Sorry, Albatos, but in my defense, you were basically a Castlevania monster to begin with. Let's start with Shy Guys, the Koopas of this game. They show up all over the place, walk back and forth without posing much of a threat, and teach you the basics of combat while also serving as a convenient stepping stone for platforming, a necessary move in some stages. One of the major themes of Yume Kojo was masked human figures, probably inspired by African tribal masks and South American carnival costumes. So naturally, the Shy Guy is one of the most common enemies. You'd think they'd be kind of scary just from reading a description of them, but somehow they mainly come across as cute. It might just be the tiny round mouth and the perpetually surprised expression it gives them. Sometimes I feel kind of bad picking them up and throwing them off cliffs to their almost certain doom. Not that it ever stopped me from doing it. Closely related to Shy Guys are Sniffits, whose mask contains a blowgun that allows them to spit bullets at you. They basically take the place of Hammer Brothers from the original Super Mario Bros., but these guys are more mobile, and their shots move in a straight line. Bezos are described in the manual as Shy Guys with wings, but they look quite different in the actual game. I never thought of them as being Shy Guys back in the day. Mechanically speaking, they're sort of a mix of Bullet Bills and above-water Cheep Cheeps, swooping down to your level and then zooming straight across the screen with their tiny pitchforks. The fact that they can fly and try to track you can be useful, as it makes them easy to jump on top of and ride. Again, one stage actually requires you to do this to advance. Ninjas are little imps that chase you along the ground, jumping at the same time you do. Despite being more of a challenge than Shy Guys, they're actually most common in the early game. I might mention here in passing that as Super Mario Bros. 2 goes on, enemies are largely replaced with platforming as a source of challenge. Bob-ombs are, as the name suggests, living bombs. These little guys have had basically the same AI for practically their whole existence. When they spot you, they try to run up and stall you until you get caught in the inevitable explosion. Usually they spawn repeatedly, either from having other enemies drop them on you, or emerging from one of those bigger-on-the-inside vases. Pokies are living cactuses that shimmy along the ground in desert stages. If you pick up a Pokie's head, the only non-damaging part of its body, the segment below that will turn into a new head, and this keeps happening until it's very small and sad, at which point you can just pick the whole thing up. Sparks are sort of like mobile, vulnerable Podoboos from Super Mario Bros. They're electrical rather than fiery, but that's really just a visual difference. And Pantsers are little flowers that tend to stay at the bottom of the screen, shooting out fireballs for you to dodge. We also have a few borderline cases who show up in only a handful of other Mario properties. Pidgeot, this game's version of Lakitu, didn't reappear until Mario and Luigi Partners in Time, nearly 2 decades after being introduced. Porcupos, who can't be stepped on, and Flurries, which skitter around in icy levels, were sort of seen again in Yoshi's Island under different names, but then they vanished from the record. And then of course there's Cobrat, Ostro, Trouter, and Hoopster, which were never seen again after this game. There, I mentioned you guys after all. Good for you. But I'm not done yet. One of the ways in which Super Mario Bros. 2 sharply differs from its predecessor is that there's a boss or mini-boss at the end of every stage, and each world has a unique boss. Okay, well technically 2 of the fights are repeats, but that's still impressive given that in the original, every boss was just Bowser again. Birdo is the most common mini-boss, and a very familiar icon of the game as a whole. The original manual described her as a cross-dressing male character. Not that cross-dressing means much when you're a naked dinosaur. But later games established her as female. Birdo walks back and forth spitting eggs and occasionally fireballs at you. Defeating her usually requires you to jump on the eggs, pick them up, and toss them right back, whereupon she'll throw up a crystal ball that permits you to exit the level. Among the bosses is Mouser, a giant bomb-chucking mouse that attended the Poochie School for the Dramatic Arts, Triclyde, a 3-headed fireball-snorting snake, Fry Guy, a living bonfire that attacks by shooting fire out of his fire, and Clawgrip, a huge rock-throwing crab who might be based on a Japanese folktale, but I wouldn't bet on it. Plus, of course, there's Wart, the evil Toadman Sorcerer King thing, who can only be defeated by throwing vegetables at him while his mouth is open, a fact that would have spared many an unnecessary game over if it had been noted at any point in the original manual. And finally, no litany of Super Mario Bros. 2's bad guys would be complete without a mention of half-enemy, half-wall decoration, Phanto, a spooky floating mask who chases you as soon as you pick up a key from the Legends of the Hidden Temple-esque room where he lies in wait. Phanto isn't really an enemy because he can't be killed, even when you're invincible, but most players learn quickly, sometimes accidentally, that he'll leave you alone if you drop the key for a second, and only return once you pick it back up. Phanto is a perfect example of why Super Mario Bros. 2, to me, is more fun than Super Mario Bros. Not simply the more complex level design alone, or the entirely different set of enemies and traps on its own, but the way these two things work together. Imagine Phanto appearing in a level from the original game, and you'll see what I mean. Having to hold onto a key while going straight from left to right and dodging an enemy that keeps following you, as well as other normal enemies, would be kind of interesting. There's a level in Super Mario Bros. 3 that does something similar, but only enough to use once or twice before it got boring. Phanto stays interesting because every time you see it, there's different challenges involved, with a difficulty curve that mirrors the rest of the game. The first time you find a key, inside a vase in the second stage, you have no idea what's going on at first. It would be easy to assume that the mask will stop chasing you once you get out of the vase, and in fact I've witnessed people making that assumption right in front of me. Then Phanto floats in from the left side of the screen, and suddenly you realize he wants his key back. In this case, the door is right next to the key, so you hurry in and breathe a sigh of relief as you continue the level. But before you even reach the end of the first world, you run into Phanto again, and this time things are already way more complicated. Now the key is at the top of a high tower that can be scaled one of two different ways, on the left by jumping up platforms, or on the right by climbing a chain. The door which the key unlocks is at the bottom of this tower, so you're immediately confronted with a dilemma. Do you go down the left path or the right? First-time players might not even be aware at this point that you can't climb vines or chains while you're holding something, so if you take the right path, you just fall all the way down. It turns out that this is actually the safer option, even though it's hard to maneuver in midair, because you fall more quickly than Phanto can fly. On the other hand, you have no idea what you'll land on. In this case, it's a mostly empty platform with one Shy Guy on it, but later levels might put spikes down there, or even let you fall to your death. The left path looks safer, and if this was an ordinary platforming segment, it would be, but the platforms slow you down and make it easier for Phanto to catch up with you. Then you drop past the entrance door, and now you're in unfamiliar territory, but with the same deranged mask chasing you down. I've seen even experienced players get freaked out here and accidentally drop or throw the key into a pit, which causes it to despawn and reappear at the top of the tower, forcing you to go back up and get it again. On the other hand, if you drop the key right in front of you, this is when you realize that Phanto only chases you while you're holding the key, even if you haven't gotten it to the door yet. So this is a moment when freaking out can actually give you an advantage, which is just magical. I should point out that the whole rest of the descent is designed to slow you down so that Phanto can get you, with hazards ranging from switchback platforms that you can't drop through, to a sneaky Sniffit who halts your progress with a barrage of bullets. Oh, and also, if you happen to fall all the way down on the left side, you end up in a spike pit that it's impossible to get the key out of, so back up you go. Super Mario Bros. 2 is full of clever set-piece challenges like this, which is one of the reasons I struggle to classify it in terms of difficulty. Minoru Arakawa is presumed to have wanted this over the Lost Levels, partly because it's an easier game. But is it? In terms of sheer reflexes, probably yes. But with its more intricate and interactive levels, Super Mario Bros. 2 stresses parts of your brain that you barely had to use at all in Super Mario Bros. Or its expansion pack sequel. I mentioned in the last video that when you compare Super Mario Bros. To arcade games, the difficulty curve for Super Mario Bros. Is more bounded than those of arcade games, but also more dynamic, depending on the player's ability to hold on to useful power-ups. The Lost Levels, being essentially a twist on the original game, is like if you took the original's difficulty curve and bumped every point on it up a few notches. It's not hard in a radically different way, except maybe for the fact that it has more levels, putting a greater physical strain on players who want to complete the whole thing in one session. Super Mario Bros. 2 never gets quite as difficult as the Lost Levels at its worst, but where I think it builds on Super Mario Bros. Is that its challenge is even more dynamic, despite the lack of power-ups. The stages in this game aren't inherently easy, but you can make them easier with the right preparation. Depending on its unique challenges, almost every stage has an ideal character to play as. By figuring out the right places to enter subspace, you can increase your default 2 points of health to a maximum of 4. And rather than depending on invincibility stars or healing items in preset locations, here you generate them yourself by grabbing cherries and defeating enemies respectively. If you're careful and keep track, this means you can get an item when you want it, rather than when the game wants to give you one. Even more than the original, this is a game that encourages you to keep playing after every game over, because you're learning the whole time that you're playing. It's a game that's always making you think, I didn't know you could do that, or how did that happen? And the realization that you've been beating your head against a wall for 20 minutes when there was a better way right in front of you can be irritating, but it's also motivating. And that feeling has way more to do with what makes a Mario game than whether or not there are Koopas in it. One thing that really stood in the way of Super Mario Bros. 2 making a lasting contribution to the Mario series as a whole was that in every other way besides basic mechanics, it didn't really build on the legacy of Super Mario Bros. Itself. It features an entirely different set of enemies, an almost entirely different collection of useful items. The mushroom and the star are the only ones both games have in common, and a design approach that prioritized enemy encounters over the first game's trademark platforming. If Nintendo had really cared about not polluting Mario's brand identity or confusing customers, they would undoubtedly have treated the American sequel as a one-off experiment that overreacted to the Japanese sequel's excessive faithfulness by going way too far in the opposite direction. Whether it sold well or not, they would have treated it as a non-canonical curiosity, rather than something to build future games off of. And in the short run, you could be excused for thinking that this is exactly what they planned to do. Super Mario Bros. 3, revolutionary as it was, clearly took the original game as its template, for better or for worse. The same sequel, which included every single enemy from Super Mario Bros., on top of a dozen or so totally new ones, featured precisely one enemy that was introduced in Super Mario Bros. 2, the Bob-omb. Luigi was back to being a palette swap of Mario, with no special moves. Princess Toadstool and Toad returned to their status as NPCs. And we witnessed the triumphant return of the classic left-to-right platforming level, with little up and down movement and no boss encounters to muddle things up. By being so willfully different, Super Mario Bros. 2 denied its series the possibility of evolving in a simple, obvious direction, with one game clearly springing off from the point where the last one stopped. Instead, the Mario series would be characterized by a kind of convergent evolution, in which two separate foundations were built up simultaneously until they started to approach each other and fuse into something quite different from what either had started out as. Many things in Super Mario Bros. 2 would eventually reappear, but only a little bit at a time. Nintendo clearly treated Super Mario Bros. 2 as more of a spice than an ingredient, something that would ruin the uniqueness of future projects if they just dumped it all in at once. It can be difficult to trace the influence that it's had on the rest of the series, because that influence is very diffuse. So when I discuss the various legacy aspects of this game, bear in mind that several of the things I bring up were absent for much of the series, and only became essential after being reintroduced by another sequel years later. Okay, here goes. The story is one of the areas in which Super Mario Bros. 2 was most innovative, for a video game at least. But possibly for that exact reason, it's also what later games in the series did the least to build on. Mario traveling through a dream world is a concept we haven't really seen since, although the setting being influenced by various real-world cultures is. That's a thread that runs through all kinds of otherwise very different Mario games, from Super Mario Land to Super Mario Odyssey, and may have helped to inspire the globe-trotting feel of RPGs, like Paper Mario and the Thousand-Year Door. Super Mario Bros. 2 also didn't introduce a single major character to the series besides Birdo, who didn't start out as a character per se. Mario, Luigi, Princess Toadstool, and even Toad had all been seen before, and while this was the first time Toadstool and Toad were playable, that hardly counts as a legacy thing, because neither of them was playable in the main series again for a good long time. Not only that, but when Toad reappeared in New Super Mario Bros. Wii, he no longer had any special abilities. Choosing him is a purely cosmetic decision, with no effect on gameplay. Luigi's high jump ultimately became a major part of his character, but that wasn't introduced here either. He had it earlier in the Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2. As for enemies, I already pointed out that only Bob-ombs made it into Super Mario Bros. 3. But Super Mario World brought back the cactus-like Pokies and the hard-to-describe Ninjas. And Shy Guys would become hugely important to the series, starting with Yoshi's Island, which had like a million different types of Shy Guy. Like Goombas from the original Super Mario Bros., Shy Guys arguably punch well above their weight in terms of influence on later games in the series. Then we have items. Yeah. None of these became essential to Mario in later entries, except the POW block, and I know I sound like a broken record here, but Super Mario Bros. 2 didn't invent that. It originally appeared in the arcade Mario Bros. In 1983, with pretty much the same function. Overall design concepts are where we get to the most interesting aspect of this game's contribution. What Super Mario Bros. 2 brought to the design of Mario wasn't a collection of design concepts so much as an attitude and a willingness to break the mold. I struggle to think of a single stage or part of a stage that clearly inspired an homage in later Mario games, except maybe the Phanto segments. But the idea that Mario could do more than run right and jump, that he could climb, dig, fall down, retrace his steps to find secrets, and venture in and out of buildings, these things were all unique to Super Mario Bros. 2 when it first came out. Picking up and throwing things didn't last long as a combat mechanic, but it did stick around. In Super Mario Bros. 3, you can pick up a Koopa shell and throw it instead of just kicking it, and you have to do so to obtain many hidden items. In Super Mario World, keys return, albeit as a way of unlocking secret exits rather than locked doors. The original concept would return later in Yoshi's Island. And finally, while Birdo herself never appeared again as a mini-boss, the idea of a mini-boss, specifically one that can be defeated by turning its own weapons against it, well, that's such a commonplace in the Mario series today that we don't even notice it. You can hardly find a boss throwing things at you in a Mario game that you can't defeat by whipping its own projectiles back at it. If Nintendo decided not to carry forward most of their design ideas from Super Mario Bros. 2 while planning the next game in the Mario series, that's not because it was an ill-conceived flop with no fans. Super Mario Bros. 2 was a big hit with American gamers, selling millions of copies more than its Japanese equivalent, although admittedly it also had a bigger install base to sell to. A big factor behind Nintendo's decision to create Nintendo of America in the first place is that the US is a bigger market than Japan. It's thanks to this game's strong sales that the Mario series has the rare distinction of placing all 3 of its NES outings among the top 5 best-selling games for that console. The only other games to sell as well are Duck Hunt and Tetris. What's more, a big part of Duck Hunt's success is owed to the fact that it was bundled with some versions of the NES. The same is true of the first and third Mario games. Only Tetris and Super Mario Bros. 2 made it onto the list without that extra boost. I'm not trying to say that the other Mario games wouldn't have outsold Super Mario Bros. 2 anyway. They both sold more than 3 times as many copies, and success like that can't be chalked up just to retailing tactics. The point is that despite how shockingly different it was from the original Super Mario Bros., fans in the United States accepted Super Mario Bros. 2 as a legitimate sequel. When Nintendo of America decided that the American market needed its own sequel to Super Mario Bros., it established a precedent that nobody, not even Minoru Arakawa, could have foreseen. From this moment on, Mario was 2 characters in one. The original gameplay-focused Japanese Mario, and what you might call the American Mario, who valued creativity and variety. 6 years before this, the American animation company Hanna-Barbera had made a Saturday morning cartoon out of Namco's Pac-Man, a cartoon that became immensely popular, even though it had the loosest connection possible with the game it was supposedly based on. Where the original game didn't provide any guidelines, American writers just made things up, based on what made sense to them and what they thought their viewers would like. Namco didn't mind. As a matter of fact, they were intrigued enough by the cartoon world that Hanna-Barbera created that they appropriated some of its ideas to make Pac-Land in 1984, and the result was one of the most innovative games of the early 1980s. With the release of Super Mario Bros. 2, something similar was about to happen to the Mario series. What had once been an unfamiliar imported product was quickly turning into a brand that seemed as domestic as apple pie and Budweiser. Within a year, there would be an American Super Mario Bros. Cartoon that also took huge liberties with the original story. And while this wasn't as big a hit as the Pac-Man show, it did a lot to define Mario for a generation of kids that wanted to hear him talk as well as watch him run. I said earlier that if Nintendo had been uptight about Mario's brand identity back in the late 1980s, Super Mario Bros. 2 would probably have sunk without a trace, whether people enjoyed it or not. It's equally true that a fussy Nintendo would never have allowed the Super Mario Bros. Super Show to be made at all, or the 1993 Super Mario Bros. Live-action movie, or the hilariously awful Philips CDI games. Super Mario Bros. 2 reflects an important part of Mario's heart and soul. It's not a big part. Arguably, it's much smaller and less substantial than the part that created Super Mario Bros. Back in 1985. But without it, Mario wouldn't be what he is. It's the pinch of yeast that leavens all that damp, stuffy dough that Mario tends to get bogged down in whenever Nintendo plagiarizes its past work too single-mindedly and forgets to innovate. It's because Nintendo wasn't fussy about its brand identity that the Mario series is more than just Super Mario. It's Mario Kart, and Mario Tennis, and Mario RPG, and Mario Party, and Mario Maker, and Mario and Luigi. It's even Dance Dance Revolution Mario Mix, and Mario Teaches Typing, and Mario Pinball Land. And when you look at this swirling galaxy of Mario weirdness, at the center you'll find what is still, to this day, one of the weirdest Mario games ever made. And damn proud of it, too.